Alright, today we'll be looking into error cards and taking an in-depth look into them. Um, Types of error cards, I'm going to separate into two types that I'm giving my own definitions to. The first type are what I'm calling well-known error cards, which this Dark Persian with no HP is an example of a well-known error card. Um, Well-known error cards I'm defining as cards that were printed in multiples that are known to have an error and are errors that are non-disputable. So something that a card either has or does not have that makes it an error card. And so for this Dark Persian promo card, this is an error card because it has what's in the description of PSA, a no 60 HP, which should be right here next to the name. And then the second type of error cards I'm defining as qualifier error cards. And the reason why I'm defining them as that is because I'm using PSA's qualification grading system for these types of error cards. So one that I have right here is a PSA 9 OC Dark Tyrant or Tyrant Dragon first edition LOB card or LOD card. If you look at this card, the centering on it is just absolutely terrible. And typically a card with this terrible of centering would never get a PSA 9, but because it qualified for this OC grade, which means that it's an off-center card, what PSA does is that they throw out the centering for grading this card, and they just look at the rest of the grading qualifications. So typically this would get maybe like a 7 or so for a grade, but because they threw out the centering, they just looked at everything else on the card and said everything else is perfect, just the centering is bad, so this card's not going to get a perfect grade because it is incredibly off-center, but because of how off-center it is, it's going to get a 9 OC. So if it wasn't for the centering, this would be a perfectly conditioned card. But because it is terribly off-centered, it got an OC qualification grade. And then PSA does this with other cards as well, not just off-center. PSA actually has 5 different qualifiers, OC for off-centered, MC for miscut, and then the last two are PD and OF, which are usually used only for older sports cards. PD stands for print defect, and OF stands for out of focus. Those two qualifiers only really apply to older sports cards printed before 1975. Because of the ink and the card stock that those cards used for printing, they can have whitening within the picture of the card, or little white dots where ink didn't quite cover the card stock, and so that will qualify it for possibly either a print defect or an out of focus blurry image for the card. So now that we've gone over the types of error cards, I'm going to talk about grading errors. And so we're going to go back to this Dark Persian card, where well-known cards typically will have a description in the PSA grading of the error themselves. So in this, it's clearly saying that the no 60 HP error is here. But that's not always necessarily the case. PSA does grade cards that are indeed errors without knowing them or giving them the qualification. One example that I can show right here is this Blastoise. So just looking at it and looking at the description, this would be a just regular unlimited base set Blastoise. But if I zoom in here, you can see on the description right there that it says put the Blastoise on and then the stage where the word stage would be at is smeared out. This is what is commonly known as the stage error Blastoise. And so when PSA first did the grading for these, or when this card was graded, I should say, PSA didn't actually recognize this as an error, so the card was just graded as a regular unlimited Blastoise. But later on, PSA did start recognizing the stage error Blastoise, and so the card was put into this description of the card. This is kind of important to talk about, just because a card isn't listed or described as an error card in like a grading description doesn't mean that it's not an error card. And then this is also important to talk about for like population report. So if you went on the PSA website and looked for stage error Blastoise, this card would be part of the population for the PSA 8s, whereas this card would not be in the population for the PSA 9 because it was just listed as an unlimited base set Blastoise instead of the stage error. And then there's also an example for Yu-Gi-Oh here that I'm hoping will eventually be changed by PSA, but has not as of yet, with the secret rare hollowing. So typically for secret rare hollows for Yu-Gi-Oh, the hollow is supposed to go in a left to right diagonal. You can see the lines for this Thousand Dragon card. And then here I have an example of an unlimited Thousand Dragon where the hollowing actually goes in the opposite direction, left to right, instead of right to left. So, and it's not listed as a error card. So I'm hoping that in the future that will get changed. So we've talked about error cards and not for qualifiers, and now it's time to go on to error cards that are non-qualifiers. And I have some examples for these. And what I mean by error cards that are non-qualifiers are that they're error cards, but PSA doesn't have any qualifications for them. So right here's an example. I have a first edition Rise of Destiny Mystic Swordsman level 6 here. And if you notice in the top, Yu-Gi-Oh is kind of unique in that it prints names in holographic, and most other trading card games at the time or trading cards weren't printed that way. But if you see here, the name is actually missing on this card. So if this was sent off to PSA and graded, it would just get graded as a regular card and would not receive any PSA doesn't have any qualification error for this, so it wouldn't have a missing ink qualification. It would just come back as a graded card. And so then, like I said before, just because PSA doesn't recognize it as an error card doesn't mean it's not an error card. And then it's also not a well-known error card, so it's not as if there were sheets and sheets and sheets of these Mystic Swordsman level 6 printed without the name. This is an error that can really happen to pretty much any Yu-Gi-Oh card, and does happen to many Yu-Gi-Oh cards. And so here are other examples as well. With this Banisher of Radiance is the first edition Enemy of Justice. The name is shifted, so this is also a very common occurrence where the name will get shifted, and it's not something that happens to just this card. It can happen to any card. And so the value on these cards is really just dependent on really the card itself, and then the condition, and what people were willing to really pay for it, and if it's graded or not, whatnot, and just how badly people want it, the rarity. So this is only a rare card with the name shifted, makes it not as valuable. If it was an ultimate rare card, this card in an ultimate rare is already valuable, but then with that extra error, it would just increase the value on this. And then here's another example for Yu-Gi-Oh. This is more of a common error in Yu-Gi-Oh than Pokemon or any other cards that have holographic on them. But if you can see, if I get the light hitting on it, that the holograph is actually not lined up with the picture. So it's actually shifted downwards, and again, this is this kind of increases the value, but this is only a unlimited card for one, so the card itself isn't very valuable. It is Toon Mermaid, which is a somewhat popular card, and then it's also an ultra rare, but it's probably not as valuable as the Mystic Swordsman without the name that I showed you earlier. And then Pokemon also has examples of these as well. So within the first edition base set, it's an error that's known as the gray stamp. So this is a first edition Pokemon English print base set card, and you can see this first edition stamp. It's kind of light. It might be hard to see it's light, and it's not very black and bold like most first edition cards are. And so I have another one here to show for an example where you can definitely see there's a big difference in the black printed stamp here. And so that's what is also known as a gray stamp. And then also here's an example of like an opinionated error card. So I'm showing you this far-fetched card that I personally think would be considered a gray stamp. It's definitely lighter than this regular first edition stamp. But I've also seen gray stamps that are much lighter than this. And then I've also seen people considering stamps to be gray even though they're darker than this. So this is an opinionated one, but this is also a very common and well-known error that PSA doesn't recognize. So if I did get this card graded, no matter what, no matter how faded this first edition stamp is, it would never get like a gray stamp error or any qualifier. That's just how it goes, you know. So this is something that, you know, collectors themselves have like come to know and have deemed, and so that's why, you know, they get these names like the gray stamp error or the no name error that can happen to any card. You know, this can happen, this no name can happen to literally any Yu-Gi-Oh card with hollow foil printed at the top, and then this gray stamp error can happen to any first edition base set card, and you know, it happens to hollows and non-hollows, commons, rares. So that's just kind of an example of the non-qualifiers where, you know, like I've said before, just because it's not recognized as an error by PSA doesn't mean that it's not an error card. But moving on, we're going to talk about are error cards collectible? And the answer is yes and no. Typically, the well-known error cards, so going back to this Dark Persian, will have a set amount. These well-known error cards, the cards that were printed with errors and are undisputed errors, ones that you can just clearly see and find if they're an error or not, they have set values typically. So say this PSA 9 no HP Persian, Dark Persian promo card. This is typically considered to be at least a $200 card. And that's something that, you know, collectors have just genuinely agreed on. That's what buyers pay for it. That's what sellers are willing to sell for it. When we're talking about these qualifier cards, it's a little more hazy. Typically with these, you know, OC and MC qualifier cards, it's really what people are kind of willing to pay for them, but also the card themselves. So this is a Tyrant Dragon first edition Legacy of Darkness card. It's an ultra rare, so that makes it valuable, and it's a first edition, which also makes it valuable. It got the 9, so everything is perfect on this card except for the centering, which has got the OC grade for it. It's Legacy of Darkness, which is a typically valuable set. So, you know, I'll say that I paid $40 for this card, which I thought was very reasonable. But someone else may not want to be willing to pay that much. Someone may be willing to pay more. It's kind of with these qualifier cards, what people are willing to pay for the cards. And it's no real set value, so it gets hazy. For these qualifier cards, I know people that love collecting them, that, you know, they think they're incredibly interesting. I myself think they're interesting and like collecting these cards. And then there's also people that just don't have any interest in them. They view them as not perfect cards, or just cards that they don't want in their own collection. These well-known error cards, however, these are typically collected by any collector. They're seen as highly valuable because, you know, they do tend to be rare, and some of the error cards of these well-known type are some of the most valuable collectible cards. So for Yu-Gi-Oh, the first edition, first artwork of the Dark Magician, or the Dark Paladin, for the MFC set, that's one of the most valuable cards that there is in Yu-Gi-Oh collecting. And then I also want to talk about knowing your errors. So just because a card is an error doesn't make it necessarily valuable. And I have an example of that here. So this is a first edition Dark Arbok. It's looking at the description, there's no error put in the description, but it is technically an error, and I'll zoom in and show you. So if you look at the bottom here, where it says 1999 and then 23,000 wizards, that's supposed to be 1999 to 2001, but that 23,000 was put and printed. And this error actually never got corrected on any of these Dark Arbok cards, so first edition or unlimited. So while this is technically an error card, the fact that this 23,000 number is here instead of the 2001 doesn't make this an error card. Or doesn't make this, I should say, it does make it an error card, but it doesn't make it any more valuable. So while it is technically an error card, it doesn't make this any more valuable because literally every card every of these cards had this error on them. And so when you're dealing with error cards, knowing your error cards is a huge part about collecting them. And that comes with just research and experience, and really just asking around and so on and so forth. So knowing errors and knowing what makes errors valuable, what cards qualify as errors and what really is an error card, is a big part about collecting these. And so I'm hoping that this video will be helpful to those of you who may want to start getting and collecting in error cards. And then just make sure to do your research so that you're not overpaying for cards that aren't worth it or aren't actual error cards. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching.